Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series of conversations, we'll be looking at the experience of finding, accessing, analyzing, teaching, and learning with primary sources and archival material. Joining me will be Dr. Rebecca Kreitz, a research fellow at the Center for the History of Medicine at the University of Warwick in the UK. Dr. Kreitz will be talking about how she has used archives and primary sources in her research and instruction. Also joining me is Felix Barnes, an editor at Adam Matthew Digital, which has launched a new platform called Research Methods Primary Sources, an online learning tool that helps students develop their primary source literacy. This 4-part series is brought to you in part by Adam Matthew. In this first episode, we talk about how primary source literacy is taught, how early undergraduate students are typically exposed to primary sources, and how all of this is supported by academic librarians. Okay, Becky and Felix, welcome to the program. Let's jump right into the questions and maybe start with introductions. Becky and Felix, where are you or where are you working and what do you do? Becky, why don't we start with you?
Hi, well, thank you for having me.
Sure.
I'm currently holding a teaching role at the University of Warwick in the UK. And my research background is in violence and crime. And I've worked on the history of domestic abuse, rape, and most recently suicide in prisons.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Felix?
Hi, so I'm Felix Barnes, and I am a publishing manager at the academic publisher Adam Matthew Digital. And a quick introduction to Adam Matthew Digital. So we work with libraries and archives all over the world to license, digitize, and then publish on websites collections of primary source material. And so my role is to help look after that process of taking these archives from physical to digital form.
Nice. Okay. So we are talking about primary sources and primary source research and literacy for this series. And Becky, why don't we kick it off with you for this question? And if you could, just talk about what primary source literacy is and how this is the same or different than other source literacies, for example.
Yeah, sure thing. I think it's important first to just think about what a primary source is. Mm-hmm. And primary sources are the materials produced by people and by processes in the past that can act as evidence to inform our comprehension of the past. And so primary source literacy is the knowledge and skills necessary to locate, to interpret, to evaluate and analyse them. And this helps us develop that richer, meaningful understanding of the past. Mm-hmm. It's important to bear in mind that primary source literacy is a very broad term. It's very inclusive. And so it demands lots of other literacies in it as well, such as informational, statistical, visual, oral, tactile, and digital. And because the kinds of primary sources we use are so diverse, we have to be so inclusive in those literacies. Mm-hmm. For example, we could use government reports, ephemera, buildings, photographs, plays, plants, and even landscapes and clothes.
So I think sometimes we tend to think of really old materials or sources, but they don't have to be old to be primary sources, right? I mean, is there a difference between researching something that's 100 years old versus something that might have been produced several months ago? Or
yeah, certainly. One of the challenges of using older sources is that often they have been collected and then preserved. So there's been a process of sifting what survived. And so we have to think about the power structures within that.
Right.
Whereas more recent sources, more recent primary sources, we could even think about things like the internet and social media. And that has its own challenges of what people intended and what they thought about what they were producing as well. So we need to, in our literacies, think about our content creators as well.
Yeah, I think we'll probably get into a little bit of that when we talk about some of your work. Felix, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I think that Becky probably touched on it at the beginning of her answer. And obviously we're in the business of working with archives, and, to extend that definition of literacy, it was almost like the literacy of locating material. Where on earth can you find this stuff? And knowing what is available. And as Becky was saying, then extending that to why it's there, how it ended up there. So, yeah, but more generally, I think it's, interesting about how you find this stuff as well as how you interact with it.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Felix, in terms of finding it, I guess you're Adam, Matthew, how are you guys sourcing this stuff and looking for it in terms of looking for materials and resources that you would like to incorporate into your platforms?
Yeah, so, a lot of our work is with what you would, I suppose, refer to as traditional archives, and this is national archives. For example, we do lots of work with national archives such as the UK National Archives at Kew, the British Film Institute. And so these are bodies, government bodies that may have collected national records, or they're collecting things in the national interest, so to speak. And then there are other, obviously, higher education bodies that collect this stuff, and also private archives, of course. And so those are the kinds of places where this historic material, and that's primarily what we work with, historic material, is held. So yes, so we have those relationships and seek to build those relationships.
Okay, excellent. Becky, curious how you typically teach primary source literacy. What are some of the guidelines that are most helpful for students in that area?
It is essential to give our students a really strong foundation in primary source literacy, because primary sources are, of course, the building blocks of historical debate, and it's important to give them regular practice in interpreting and evaluating them. And this, in turn, can help them think critically about secondary sources and the scholarly conversation. So usually we try to embed primary sources within our teaching sessions, whether that be seminars, lectures, or workshops. And so later this week, my students will be using a recording of the Russian song On the Hills of Manchuria to explore ideology and nationalism in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5. So the main guidelines that I offer are the usual ones: never to approach a source cold, to do some background reading on core themes or the subject more generally first, and to think carefully about why and how a source has survived and what others might not have, and what that means for the data we can get. To consider the context in which it was created, think about who created it and what they hope to achieve by it, and also how it was received and thought about, or even later used by others. And so I encourage students not to ask whether a source is useful, and this is quite common among first-year undergraduates, because every source is useful to a researcher if they ask the right questions. So instead, I ask them to consider what sort of historical questions a source raises.
And I'm wondering, I think the last time we spoke, when we were sort of preparing for this episode, you mentioned, you talked a little bit about sort of the way students who are coming into first year undergraduate study, how prepared are they for working with primary source material?
Generally, most of the sources that they will have engaged with are primary sources that have been provided to them by their teachers and their educators. So it means that bit of their literacy where they look for material and try to find those primary sources and then think about how to analyse them, usually that is somewhat absent. And so that's something we try to help them develop in their early years of their academic career.
Excellent. Okay. And then Felix, I'm wondering, how might these observations Becky's just shared be reflected in Adam Matthews' resources?
Sure. Well, this is the thing, really. Adam Matthew is primarily a publisher of primary source material, and over the past, it must be 30 odd years, Adam Matthew, at first doing microfilm, and then obviously digital imaging, must have published millions and millions of pages of source material, plus hours and hours of film material. And so this is now something we're becoming increasingly interested in, is how to support people make the most of all this material. So hence we're creating a platform called Research Methods Primary Sources. And this is to, help students engage with this stuff. So that, runs through a wide range of things of what an archive is, why they exist, and then, questions you should be asking when you deal with this source material. So, and as I say, we're interested in getting scholars to really step students through how they would engage with a primary source. One other thing it may be worth mentioning is that I remember at school and even at university, you're quite often obviously dealing with transcripts of materials. Particularly at school, you're dealing with things, well, in my day, in textbooks, in printed textbooks, and obviously Adam Matthew, we published the facsimile, effectively a digital facsimile of the source. So there's lots of other things you have to deal with, which is paleography and identification, and you are slightly closer to the, obviously it's not an original and all the lovely things that brings, but you're a step closer to the original.
Mm-hmm. Right. Excellent. So in that case, Becky, it's good that you're here with us as, mm-hmm. an instructor. How do you typically expose students to primary sources? Do you set them onto the source itself, or are resource platforms and digital collections helpful starting points, since they can tend to add functionality or instructional guidance?
Yeah, well, a bit of both, really.
Yeah.
At the beginning of students' careers, I find it really helpful to choose the sources that they would engage with, mm-hmm. because this lets me guide them through the interpretation of unusual or difficult material. So I might have it up on a screen, or use a projector, or if it's a physical item, pass it around. This can really help them develop and expand those core skills required for primary source literacy. Then as they become more confident, I like them to find and bring a source to a seminar for discussion. That helps to promote good practice and give them agency over their historical inquiry. Resource platforms and digital collections are really great for this. They give students this broad and deep repository to explore. And I, as their educator, can be confident that students have this supportive environment in which to practice their source literacy. It is a far cry from a quick Google search where everything is out of context.
Right.
And this is why these repositories are so great. They've got the metadata. It's clearly signposted. Guidance is provided. And this is something that I really like about Adam Matthew's approach, especially their instructional how-tos and case studies. They're just great for students who want to develop their source literacy further without direction from their educators.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You just heard from Dr. Rebecca Kreitz, a research fellow at the Center for the History of Medicine at the University of Warwick in the UK, and Felix Barnes, an editor at Adam Matthew Digital. This episode is brought to you in part by Adam Matthew. Join us next week for a conversation about the ways in which Dr. Kreitz approaches her use of primary source material, how she incorporates these sources into her writing, and how the use of primary sources has changed over time.
It's essential for my area of research, which is violence and crime. I focus on the histories of those who are exploited, abused, and oppressed. And usually that means they've been silenced in the historical record. So primary sources can actually have this really radical function to challenge the historical record so far, or collective memories that reify and reproduce those unequal power structures.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.